Deadhead Fred, we've been here before. On September 20th, 2019, I released a video about this game. Like Silent Hill 3, I'm not really happy with the quality of it. It's poorly filmed, poorly constructed, and I failed to talk about a lot of things. So rather than standing behind a lazier, younger me, I think it's finally time we go back and give this game the fresh second look that it deserves. First though, a little bit of backstory. Deadhead Fred was originally released on August 28th, 2007 right here in the United States. 2 months before the game was set to release, publisher D3 would fully acquire the game's development studio Vicious Cycle. I failed to mention it the first time around, but this game was supposed to be a really big deal for them. Vicious Cycle originally pushed the idea of a more kid-friendly platformer, where the player would take the role of Geo, a mascot type who could switch his heads between various geometric shapes to solve platforming puzzles. That idea got shot down by more than one publisher on the back of a growing market for more adult video games. Rather than just starting over completely, Vicious Cycle took what they already had and reworked it into the gothic noir theme that we ended up with, while keeping some of the cartoonish charm intact. I've heard this story before. Conker's Bad Fur Day is another platformer where the kid-friendly aspect was dropped in favor of something more suitable to adults. I don't think the decision-making process was the same, but the general process is all too familiar. Vicious Cycle took the game to Sony, who loved the prototype that they saw and approved it for PSP release before a publisher had even been secured. Unfortunately, that's where the fairy tale ends. Shortly after getting approval to launch on the PSP, publisher D3 would go on to acquire the publishing rights. From there, Vicious Cycle's vision for Deadhead Fred was all but ignored in favor of focus groups. D3 brought in numerous focus groups to criticize every single aspect of the game, which ultimately led to many of the final decisions being made not by Vicious Cycle, but instead by literally everyone else. When the game finally released, the only thing left from the original game was the head-switching mechanic. But that really wasn't an optional inclusion. The entire game was going to be built on that mechanic from the beginning. Fast forward a little bit. Deadhead Fred is already out, and the critics have officially proclaimed that it's slightly above mid. There was optimism that this could multiply into a franchise. In 2009, publisher D3 announced that Deadhead Fred would be getting a sequel, but since then there have been no word of development or existence. Vicious Cycle was dissolved in 2016, and D3 America was reformed into a mobile shovelware publisher. To add insult to injury, the price of the game was lowered significantly, and it was re-released in Japan as part of the Simple 2000 Portable series. This is the only Simple series game I've covered so far that wasn't originally a Simple series game. With that in mind, I think it's safe to assume that Deadhead Fred 2 is, well, dead. That's enough backstory for now. Let's actually talk about the game. This first cutscene is written really well and provides the player with most of the essential story components. First, we learn that the city we're in, called Hope Falls, has recently become a cesspool of mutation after the construction of a nuclear power plant. Our deadhead detective Fred here was investigating the plant's owner, a local mafioso named Mr. Pitt. Unfortunately for Fred, he gets whacked and wakes up on the operating table of one Dr. Steiner. Steiner here works for Mr. Pitt, but he doesn't particularly like the guy. This creates an almost instant "the enemy of my enemy is my friend" mentality. Moments later, we get introduced to Mr. Pitt and his henchman Lefty. They tell Steiner that they know that he stole the detective's body parts, and shortly thereafter, they escort him away. This first part of the game takes us on a fairly linear tour through a part of Steiner Mansion. I must have been high as a kite the first time I played through this because it was nowhere near as long or tedious as I thought it was. While we're on that subject, let's talk about the gameplay for a minute. Deadhead Fred is a traditional retro beat-em-up, but in a 3D space. You mash a button to punch, you block once in a while, and you have a simple to execute special move that does a lot of damage. When an enemy is stunned, you can perform a finisher to rip their head off. Enemies also flank constantly, and you can only block in one direction, so it doesn't feel great. There are also a couple of consumable items that do things you would expect, like restoring health and increasing damage for a temporary period in time. This game is also a platformer, sort of. Most of the platforming segments were removed and replaced with combat due to the response from D3's focus groups, but that doesn't mean platforming is non-existent. It works, it's functional, but it doesn't feel polished. Fred's jump is an incredibly stiff motion, and it looks and feels seriously awkward. It's also the primary victim of this game's biggest issue, the camera. The camera is garbage. It moves automatically and often positions itself somewhere inconvenient. You can rotate the camera manually by holding block and tilting the analog stick, but it will almost always put itself back into a bad spot. It also sits fairly low when outside of combat, and I hate that. You know how Bubsy 3D does that thing where the camera angles down when you jump? In most games with platforming, that's something that I just do naturally. I'm not saying this game should auto-tilt to that extreme with every jump, but a tiny zoom out with a slight downward tilt would have been a massive improvement. I'm accustomed to having the right analog stick to control camera movement, and when I don't have it, there's usually some compromise to make up for it. Here, There is no compromise, and it makes things much more uncomfortable. You don't have to think very hard to figure out that there's an obviously better control scheme for all of this. Instead of having consumables mapped to left and right on the D-pad, the camera control should be mapped to the entire D-pad. Consumables should be usable from the item menu, and up and down should be used to zoom the camera in and out, with the highest inward value being aim mode and the highest outward value being isometric. Left and right on the D-pad should be used for rotating the camera left and right. The problem is that consumables are made to be essential because of the shitty enemy AI and their constant flanking. If blocking auto-turned, or if you could turn while blocking, that wouldn't be a problem. A great opportunity to make this game more comfortable was when it was ported to the Vita. That didn't happen though. The Vita port of this game is identical, with a grand total of 0 changes, despite having the addition and benefit of a second analog stick and triggers. I know it shouldn't bother me so much, but this game came out in 2007. If games in the 90s could figure out how to comfortably map camera controls, then there just isn't any excuse for this. You can make the argument that by preference it doesn't bother you, but that opinion doesn't change the fact that it's objectively a technical fault. It's a bad design. It's unjustifiably uncomfortable for the time period. Even for the limitations of the PSP, it just isn't good. That's enough about the camera though. Let's talk about the mechanic that this game was built on, the head switching. In reality, it's a glorified version of any other game's weapon wheel, but years before the weapon wheel became a common inclusion. Holding L and tilting the stick in a direction will select a head on the wheel, and each of the heads serve a different purpose. The basic head is what you'll do most of your fighting with, since it has the most powerful special move and does the most damage against zombies. The other two starting heads are the zombie head and the stone head. The zombie head is mostly for platforming and puzzles. Holding the jump button with it equipped is every platformer's slow fall mechanic. It can also suck and store liquid for putting out fires and solving puzzles. The stone head is bulky and slow, but it can break through walls and iron crates, and it prevents drowning. I like the head switching mechanic, but this brings us back to one of the bigger problems with this game. The developers clearly wanted to make a platformer, and the focus groups clearly wanted them to make an action game. You can see this rift between the dev team and the testers very prominently. Personally, I'm with the testers on this one. It's not necessarily that having platforming is a bad thing or that it wouldn't be a good platformer, but rather the platforming that exists is subpar. It cuts through the good enough action gameplay with a knife made of discomfort. This was 2007, so by now we have proof that you can make a good action platformer hybrid with games like God of War, Psychonauts, Destroy All Humans 1 and 2, fucking Devil May Cry. The reason those games work so well, and this doesn't, is because of the absolutely horrendous camera controls. Even Daxter, a game from the exact same console, with the exact same limitations, managed to be a better action platformer hybrid. The problem wasn't the idea, it was the execution. The camera somehow manages to be both incredibly bad on its own and create a domino effect where other things are bad because of it. That sucks because behind the camera ruining a massive portion of the game, there's a really good idea here built on a solid, collaborative foundation between the devs and the focus groups. The art in this game is fucking sweet, and to say it reminds me of any one single thing would be wrong. It's so unique. There's a feeling of timelessness to the art direction that sets it apart from the majority of other games. This art is combined with a really good script, a great cast of characters, and a really visceral soundtrack composed by the duo responsible for Alpha Protocol's kick-ass spy film soundtrack.
What the fuck? What have you done to me?
Please, let me explain.
You've got about 2 seconds before I rip off your head and make us identical twins. Now where is my friggin' head?
That becomes you, Detective Fred.
You got me at a disadvantage here, lady. Who the hell are you?
My friends call me Juju Judy. You can call me anytime.
Here, take this. When you collect 5 heads, give me a call at the head shop. The number's stored in there.
Hey, don't you need this?
Nah, I never use up all of my minutes anyway. Damn phone company.
I mentioned the script, and I have to give credit to all sides for how good it is. It's written naturally, there's great comedy mixed in, and the actor's delivery is really top-notch. You can hear in every inflection that this was something the cast got to have some fun with. Fred himself is voiced by John McGinley, and his performance is great. The mob boss Pitt is voiced by the late film legend John Polito. The names of the characters are fairly clever too. Fred is named Fred Newman, after the real-world actor-director Fred Newman, who's legendary for every number of reasons. The Hunchback Sam Spade is named after the private detective character Sam Spade from Dashiell Hammett's crime noir novels, and it's a clever pun that works with his position as the graveyard keeper. Juju Judy gets her name from a few different things. First from Judy Garland, who wrote the song Voodoo, which is the whole theme for the character. Next from the inflection of the stuttering caused by fear. Third from the real-world use of Juju as a property of the supernatural. You can see the passion put into the writing in the world. You can hear the passion from the the actors. There's a lot of charm here that you just don't see very often. Looking back, I'll admit my first review of this game was unjustifiable laziness. I walked into it without looking at it first, and then I spent the majority of my time complaining. This time around, I still haven't beaten the game. I've still done a lot of complaining, but at least I've gone into it with an empty mindset and the willingness to analyze my experience critically. There are so many awesome things here, and the one major flaw, the camera, is something that I can sort of muzzle through to enjoy what is ultimately a classic. It's a shame that we never saw this become the series that it wanted to be, because there was a lot of room for improvement here. But this game stands really strong on its own regardless of that. It's not perfect, it's not bad, and I think I can confidently give it a rating of 6 out of 10. Last time, I didn't want to give the game a proper rating because I hadn't finished it. I'm not sure what crazy shit I was thinking that had me believing that, but I don't think finishing a game is a mark of quality. The reality is that I should know what I think long before the end, otherwise I might waste my time finishing something that I just don't want to. In this case, it doesn't matter whether I finish it or not. The gameplay is fun-ish, the visuals are good, and I laughed at the jokes. If I weren't for the shitty camera, I would rate this game higher, but even if that were the case, this still wouldn't be a 10 out of 10, and finishing it wouldn't change that. Don't get me wrong, it's good, but it's not really one of the best games ever, or really even the best of its kind. It's more like an upper-middle cult classic. I'm glad that I went back to it, but now that I have, I'm also glad to be done with it. Thank you, and have a nice day.